Okay, excuse me for that. I think I might as well get started now. This is a bit of an impromptu presentation for, as I said, just a bit of an impromptu presentation. Please excuse the title there that says Week 8. Obviously it's not Week 8, it's Week 11. I managed to change everything else, but I've forgotten to change the week from last semester. So obviously this was this was when we did presentations in summer semester of last year. We're now in Week 11, coming to the very end of it, and our presentations are due in another few weeks' time. Today, this is really all about going through what presentations are, how you would construct a presentation. You've no doubt seen quite a lot of them in the classes that you've attended, and this is just giving you an idea of how to put one together yourself, what will need to be included in it, the things that you want to avoid, and obviously the things that you want to make sure that you do include. It's not going to be very long, but as we don't have classes, I thought that it was best for us to have a presentation where we can run through everything. And when I've run through the general overview of presentations, I'll actually look at a presentation. We'll walk through what the person's done, what was good, what worked really well, and the sort of things that I would like you to be striving for when you're doing your presentations. Okay, so a little bit of the housekeeping stuff to start with, which we usually do. So week 14, beginning the 1st of June. That's the week that we'll be doing our presentations. The times and dates are still to be advised. I have mentioned that a number of times, but just to reiterate that it is that we still have to decide on the times and dates, but they will be in week 14. Okay, you have a calendar. And you'll notice that the university semester calendar runs up to week 13. It doesn't tell you when week 14 is. So what I'm doing now is I'm telling you week 14 begins on the 1st of June. Given the number of students we have, we'll be running 3 sessions. It's not manageable to run them all together, to have everyone presenting on the same day. It'd be ideal, probably for all of us, but it's not really practical. And what I will be doing is the sessions will all be running in the evening. So we won't actually run them during the day. It's just a little bit too hard to manage in that regard. So they'll be run over 3 evenings in week 14, but you are only expected to attend the one session on which you'll be presenting. You are also expected to attend from the start of the presentation to the end. Not just your presentation, but the entire session. So because a lot of this does rely on your interaction with the person who's presenting, we do require everyone to attend for the entire time. Now, as I said, it's not on campus. It will be done in Collaborate, and Collaborate is essentially the way I'm presenting at the moment. You'll have used Collaborate in different classes throughout the course of your studies. Whether you've done presentations or not, I'm not entirely sure. But you will have noticed today I posted a link in the announcement section, and I also posted a link on our Facebook page. And that was a link to the Collaborate session that I'm actually presenting in at the moment. Just in case anyone wanted to log in, they could listen, they could ask a few questions along the way. We'll be doing exactly the same thing. I will be providing you with a link for the Collaborate session that you'll be presenting in, and that's what you will use to arrive in the room in order to present. I don't think I've actually mentioned it in any of the slides, but just as and I will be saying this prior to the event, but do make sure that when you're presenting, on the night that you're presenting, whether the session is a 5 until 7 or a 7 till 9, that you arrive at least, I would say, 30 minutes ahead of time. If you've used Collaborate before, you know that there can be some issues. You can find that you can't log in quickly. The last thing you want is a situation where you can't log in and it's dead on time. Now, if you try as much as you can to log in and you simply can't, or you're having problems, in particular if you're having problems logging in, what you do is you will continue trying, but post a message on the Facebook page. It will be much easier if you post a message there just to say, look, I'm struggling, I can't log in, I'm continuing to try to get into the session, but I'm having a few difficulties. Post that message on Facebook and I can perhaps try to provide you with an answer, or especially if you're scheduled to be one of the first presenters, I can just rearrange the schedule slightly and move someone up while you're waiting to get into the session. Okay? However, Collaborate is relatively tried and true, so there shouldn't be any reasons why people aren't able to get into the session. Same thing happens if you do find that you're getting in and you're getting bumped out. Just let me know what's happening via a post to Facebook. It will get there much quicker than if you're trying to get through to me via email. I won't really want to have my emails open while I'm running the Collaborate session. So, okay. So problems to Facebook on the night, but fingers crossed that people won't have any issues. Okay. The presentations themselves, you'll see the information is in your assignment briefs, and we will talk about it coming up to the date, but you will be presenting on your topic, so that's your project. You'll be presenting on that for 15 to 20 minutes. Then you have an additional 5 minutes in which you will ask at least one question of the audience, and those are the people who are also connected in via Collaborate and myself. Okay, you're expected to ask a minimum of one question. Obviously, given that you only have 5 minutes, if it's a good question and you get some engagement with the audience, then you'll use probably the whole 5 minutes with answers coming in on that particular question. If it's a question that people struggle with, that people can't engage with, if it's perhaps not really a well-constructed question, and I'll mention that a bit later, then it's always wise to have a backup question. If you get no response from the first one, just say, okay, that's fine. Perhaps we can look at a second question and people might be able to engage with that. Given that we all have busy lives to lead, the presentations can't run over time. They'll be strictly enforced and you'll be cut off after your 20 minutes. That's your presentation. The presentation itself, in which you discuss the project that you've been working on, 20 minutes will be the maximum that you get and you'll be cut off dead. I'll have moderator facilities, so I'll actually be able to cut off your audio. But what I'll be doing is, as you're running your presentation, I will alert you. I'll post a little message to the sidebar. You'll be able to see that says 10 minutes left, 5 minutes left, 2 minutes left. So you'll know when it's time for you to finish, so when the 20 minutes is up. The same will apply for your 5 minutes. You'll get 5 minutes exactly. Once the 5 minutes is up, that's the end of it. It's obviously, given those restrictions, it's very important that you know that you can present all of your material, or the material that you have to discuss, within the time frame. You don't want to find yourself rushing. You also want to test your presentation ahead of time. If using Microsoft PowerPoint, there is a facility where you can record yourself. You can see how long you're taking. And do give yourself a little bit of extra time just to accommodate nerves. If you set your presentation out so that there is absolutely no time left, then you run the risk of not having enough time if something happens while you're presenting. If you perhaps stumble over a word, if perhaps something doesn't move quite so smoothly, if you If you just feel a bit tense and nervous on the day, you might find that you're not presenting quite as fluently. So having just a little bit of extra time is beneficial. That means when you're timing yourself in your preparation, if your presentation is always finishing 20 minutes, perhaps look at a way that you can trim it back a little bit to about 18. Just want to give yourself a little bit of leeway, just in case something does come up, that you can take a bit of a breath, slow things down a little bit, and not find yourself rushed. And of course, you do want to ensure that everything that you want to say can be said within the time frame. Otherwise, you'll have an incomplete presentation, and that will obviously affect your mark. Now, the question is, what do I present? So, I've mentioned that this is on your project. So you'll be talking about your project. Now, people might think, well, what do I talk about with my project? There's a lot of complex things that are involved in it. There's a lot of theory, perhaps. There's a lot of facts. There's a lot of figures. Well, what do I talk about? What you're doing, given that you only have 15 to 20 minutes, you have to think, what can I present within 15 to 20 minutes that will have everyone leaving with an understanding of the project I'm doing? So what you're doing is providing an overview of the project. If you're struggling to think, where do I get an overview of the project from, think about the design document. The design document provided you with an overview of, or provided me with an overview of the project you'd be doing. What you've done is condensed everything to a very manageable chunk. Now, this is part of the assessment that falls onto you, is to be able to manage the entire project into 15 to 20 minutes. You need to be able to work out what you want to talk about, what you want to focus on, and what is it that doesn't really need to be discussed. As a hint, if you have a 24 credit point project and you've done a literature review, you wouldn't want to spend 10 minutes going through the entire literature review. You'll want maybe a point or two that comes from there, but you won't want to spend all of your time on that. You'll want to talk about the who, what, why, when, where and how of your presentation, which we'll discuss a little bit more as I move through the slides. And what you should be doing is thinking about how to present this in a way that people might actually find it a little bit interesting. People might be engaged in the topic. So think about what it is that is interesting about what you're doing. And you want to emphasise what it is that you found interesting, what it is that motivated you to do the work, because that will get people engaged. Following on from what I just said, focus on communicating the most important ideas. Okay? How do I find the most important ideas? Well, you might like to go through your project and you might like to write down a series of titles. And those titles will be the key parts of the project. These will be the key components. This might be the why did I do it? Who did I do it for? What did it take? What sort of things did I have to do? What did I find out? What did work? What didn't work? You also want to provide an overview. You want to provide some background to the topic. So you can't just talk about doing a project. You'll have to provide a little bit of an understanding. Otherwise, people will be sitting there listening to your presentation and they won't know what you're talking about. Think about what you would need if you were in an audience and you were listening to someone talk for 15 to 20 minutes about a project. You would need them to provide you with a very brief background to the project, to the key topic. What is it about? What are the main themes? That's fine. Present that, and then you can move on to what the person did. But I just need a little bit of background to start with. Don't provide a blow-by-blow account of your project. That means you don't want to go through it and saying, firstly I did this, then I moved on to doing this, then I did this, then after I'd done that I did it. It's very repetitive, it's very dull, it doesn't engage people. So once again, focusing on disseminating the key or controversial points about the topic. After you've set the scene by providing a bit of background, Then you want to go into these key topics, or the controversial points. What is it that people, what is it that you found most engaging? What are the main controversies about the topic? What are the main issues, the most contentious parts of the topic? Those are the things that will actually engage the audience. And thinking about what you're doing here, you're really presenting to people, you're just letting everyone know what it is you've been doing for this whole semester on your project. But when you're conveying things like controversies, areas of interest, gaps in research, those are the things that you'll probably have found the most interesting yourself, and that engagement that you've had with the topic will come through in the presentation. People will actually respond to you being enthusiastic about what you've done. Technology, okay, this is obviously very important for us. They're really very simple. You need a headset to participate in the Collaborate session. The headset can be any form of headphones that you can actually just listen to the presentation through. If you have a quiet space by yourself, you might need to actually pop headphones on because you'll be listening to us. You do need to be able to listen to every one of the presentations though, because it is expected that you will respond to the questions that people are asking. Okay? You will not see the text come up on the screen, so you need to be able to hear what it is that people are saying. It's also a courtesy for everyone that you do take the time to prepare yourself to listen to what they're doing, just as they'll be doing the same for you and listening to what you present. Okay, checking system requirements for Collaborate. I've actually just popped a little link there, so you can go to that to have a look to see what's required. If you have a built-in microphone on your computer, you can use that. Otherwise, you will need to find another way of being able to speak clearly and be heard clearly. Now, it's something that you are required to do for yourself. It's not something that I will do for you. This is part of what we spoke about in week 1, where I help you with the map, I help you to walk the path, but I do not do the digging for you. You have to be able to present clearly. Now, I appreciate that people have varying degrees of comfort with English as a first language. It's not everyone's first language. But at the least, you need to be able to be using a device where you can be heard clearly. And I think that's especially important if English isn't your first language. You don't want to disadvantage yourself. So what you want to do in advance, as soon as possible even, is just to check the device that you'll be using. You might use Skype at home, you might use any number of other things, but you just want to make sure that when you're speaking, people will be able to hear you clearly. It has been an issue with previous presentations, and it certainly does not improve your mark. You will lose marks because people won't be able to hear what you're saying clearly. Okay? But this is something that the onus is on you. It's your responsibility to be able to have a device that you can listen clearly and speak clearly and be understood. Okay? I mentioned questions. So you need to ask at least one question of the audience to stimulate discussion. Now, when I say ask the question, yes, one option is that you'll verbally ask it, and it will only be asked, they'll only be aware of it by hearing. I think it makes far more sense to ask the question but also have a slide that has the question on it. That way people can be looking at the question, they can be engaging with the question instead of having to think, what did they say, what does it mean? So I would suggest you put the question or questions on a slide. If you've got more than one question, it's perhaps the best idea to have one slide per question. Okay. So what you want to do also is when you're asking the question, you need to be aware that not everyone has the same education as you do. We have IM students and we have LIS students. Now, the LIS students will have learned different things to the IM students. So when you're asking a question, you have to think, is it possible for the audience, and I don't know who they'll be, to answer my question? That means you have to ask it in a way that anyone, even without specialised knowledge, can respond to it. Okay? So if your project is dealing with something very complicated and very complex, or you're dealing with a very specific program, you need to think of a question that is broad enough for the entire audience to answer. Okay? So you don't want to be asking a question that requires them only to have been doing library and information studies or only doing information management. Okay? So that's part of the responsibility you have. Think of a question which deals with the topic, but is still broad enough that the audience themselves will be able to engage with. Now, slides. What you're seeing at the moment are all PowerPoint slides. Okay, not very exciting, but they're not horrendously dull. They're easy to read. That's one key thing. And they're clear. The font's quite legible. I've got a little bit of colour in the background, but the text stands out quite nicely. So what you have to do is, I'm asking you to use PowerPoint, and you have to prepare those slides, and you have to deliver them to me a minimum of 24 hours before the presentation is due. Okay? You can't be giving them to me an hour before, because I won't be around to take them. They need to be uploaded by me for the Collaborate session. So I need them a minimum of 24 hours prior to your presentation starting. I mentioned there non-standard fonts and animation. So this is what Collaborate will do. Collaborate won't react very well to things that are a little bit overly creative. If you want to use, so don't use animation. It's just the movement can sometimes it just won't translate too well to Collaborate, and we don't want something like that to just affect your ability to do the presentation. So now, if you're using anything in that nature, you actually need to supply the slides as JPEG files, so one image per file. There we go, and I've actually mentioned, do a Google search if you're not sure how to export the slides as images. It isn't particularly difficult. But the main way around that, of course, is to avoid the non-standard fonts and animation or anything which is overly elaborate in terms of the graphics you use. You don't want the images, you don't want the graphics to be lost because Collaborate hasn't handled them very well. You don't want the graphics to be all of a sudden in Collaborate imposing on the text. So you want to keep them quite simple, keep it at a minimum so that there can't be any chance that it will affect it. Okay, so now, and I'm looking at the time thinking I must have spoken very quickly. This is a bit of a guide for you. How quickly am I speaking? Am I speaking too quickly for you to understand? And if I'm doing it in a presentation, then there's a bit of a guide. You should be thinking, are you going to be doing it in a presentation? Thinking about the pacing, thinking about how much time he's taking to say each thing, how much time he's giving me to be able to absorb what it is he's said. Okay. So the key elements of the presentation. An opening, transitions, and we'll go through all of these, don't just put them up there. A conclusion, the language, the length, the volume and clarity. We touched on volume and clarity just a minute ago, and I just had a bit of a discussion there about the length of the presentation as well. So the opening. This is where you'll outline the purpose and direction of the presentation. And I've said you'll keep reminding the audience at each stage. So now, as an example, how will you be doing that? This is the way. In this presentation, I'll be talking about these things. I will begin by discussing this thing. Then I will move on to discuss the other elements of the project. Once you've moved through the first thing, you'll say, now I will move on to discussing Section B, Section C, Section D. So you actually pace the people through. If you don't do that and you just move from one section into another, there might be a very logical order to them, but there is the chance that people can get lost. What can be happening here is that you're introducing new knowledge for people. So they have to absorb the new knowledge. If you don't give them warning that you're moving from one piece of it to another, they can find, well, I don't see the connections. I'm a bit lost. I thought we were talking about something else. So this is what you do. And this also helps you to take a breath. It helps you to divide the sections and just allows you to be in control of the pace. So I've been talking about the technical requirements that are required for a presentation in Collaborate. What I'll do now is I'll go on to talk about the structure of the project, or the structure of the presentation. I've given you an outline of the structure of the presentation, and now I'll be talking about each one of those things specifically. Okay? It also gives you something to fall back on. Right? But it makes it very clear to people what they're hearing. It makes it very clear to them where one piece finishes and one piece begins. Okay. And that leads directly into transitions. Essentially what I'm talking about here is what I just did. As I explained the opening, I explained the value of prefacing your movement from one section, one step, or one phase into the next. Essentially, that's a transition. So it progresses logically from step to step as one element, theme, or idea leads naturally to the next. What that means, in very simple terms, is that if we start with item A, and then we move to item D, but we needed to know B and C, then there is no logic. We don't start with the conclusion and move our work up to the beginning, or have the beginning in the middle. There is a logic. This is very, very simple because you do it yourself in conversation. And if you think about your presentation as a formal, because there is an audience, a formal, structured conversation. You want people to understand what you're talking about, and that means you need to say things in a logical sequence. If you were providing people with information in a general conversation, you would provide them with the background. Have you heard about such and such? Oh, you haven't? Well, this is what it is. Now I'm going to tell you why it's really important to me. That's what you do without really thinking in a conversation. You need to provide people with a background so they know what you're talking about. And then you go into the interesting part for you, the novel part for you. So you move logically from one thing to another. You support your presentation by providing some background so people know what the key terms are, the key concepts. They understand why you're doing it, why you thought it was interesting, what value you think it has for people in the future. This is the logical steps that you'll actually be taking. Okay, we'll walk through that when I look at an example of a presentation, and you'll actually see the logical steps. It's not elaborate. It's very simple because we have only got 15 to 20 minutes, but it's logical that we start from one thing, we move naturally into the next. If you also want to look at the presentation that I've done, I believe that there is a logic to the order that I've presented things. I have walked through it. I have discussed the key elements. I've discussed the technical parts of it, the opening, the transitions, and then I've moved into things like language. So what we want to do is we want to use language that is easily accessible for the audience. And as I said before, you have to be very aware that people in the audience don't have the same level of understanding about your topic or education as you do. So an IM student needs to be aware that there are LIS students in the audience, and an LIS student needs to be aware that there are IM students. If you just talk and if you only use jargon, everyone will be lost. If you don't make people understand what these terms are, and sometimes you do need to use the jargon. Sometimes it's very important that you talk about things in the way that they're spoken of in an academic setting. But you still need to give people information so that they understand what that is. Okay? But even if you do need to use some level of jargon, the entire presentation can't be filled with it. Otherwise, what you'll find is that the only person who's interested in the presentation is you. and everyone else is just politely sitting there waiting for it to finish. Okay? I've mentioned the length before, and I'll just go back over that. Run to the right length. Don't go over time. If you're timing yourself and you keep pushing up against 20 minutes, look at a way to take a couple of minutes off, just in case. It's much better that you finish with a minute, 2 minutes to spare, than I cut you off at 20 minutes and you haven't concluded. You haven't actually told us what it is that was the point of doing it, of doing the project, that you haven't gone through all of your findings, that you haven't talked about what it is that you learn. And because that will logically come at the end, if you don't pace yourself, you'll find that we'll find that one of the most interesting things gets cut off and we never find out what it is that was interesting, what novel things you found, what suggestions you have for the future. Volume and clarity. I think there's they make a lot of sense. Speak loudly enough to be heard and clearly enough to be understood. I think that the international students, once again, I think it's quite beneficial to be aware of the pacing, because you are unfortunately having to use a language that's not your first language. You might need to just take a little bit more time to speak clearly. That's fine. So you can pace your presentation to take that into account. But the local students, where English is the first language, have to be aware that not everyone in the audience is in the same position. So you need to be careful that you do not speak so quickly that the audience can't understand you. You need to think about a way to pace your speech and to moderate your speech so that everyone can understand. Once again, that goes back to using words, using language that people won't be able to engage with. If the message is lost, the presentation hasn't succeeded. Conclusion. You'll notice I actually had these in a slightly different order. Well, I actually had conclusions after transitions, but I decided I was going to put this at the end because, logically, that's where our conclusions go. The conclusion, you'll provide a summary of the main points. So you'll get to a certain point and you'll say, okay, right, I've talked about the background to the topic. I've told you what it is that I did during the topic. I explained to you why it is I chose this topic and why I thought that it was valuable, why I thought it was interesting. Now I'm actually going to wrap it all up and I'm going to tell you what it is that I found out. This might be what the gaps that you recognised in the research that's been done, or a gap in terms of something that technically hasn't been done if you're actually creating something. I know we do have one person who's creating something. You just want to let people know, call this conclusion, findings, summation. This is where we sum everything up and say, this is what I got out of it. So the conclusion can be where I acknowledged, the gaps I found in the work that's come before me. This can also include where I might recommend that future work has to be done. And this also could include something about what I actually learned personally. These would be small sections of the conclusion. Things I might learn about myself in terms of my ability to be able to do work like this. Something I learned about my knowledge, that I actually had more knowledge than I thought I had, or I had less than I believed I would have to begin with. But this is really where you get to express yourself and to say, this is where I see the topic going into the future. This is what I think people need to do. This is what I think hasn't been done but should be. This is the part that I find the most interesting, to be honest. Questions, we talked about it again, but as I said, I'm going to keep going over them so they're very clear. One question at least. Not everyone doing the same major, so once again, make sure that the question is accessible for everyone. It doesn't have to be incredibly simple. It has to be based on your topic, on your project, but it still needs to be put in a way that people can find a way to engage with it. Okay? So you have to tailor your question to a general audience. It's something you'll find when you're doing presentations. If you were doing a presentation only to students who had done exactly the same subjects as you, or if you're doing a presentation in one subject where everyone had done exactly the same work, then obviously you're talking to an audience that everyone has exactly the same level of knowledge, and you can be perhaps a little bit more specific. You don't have to think so general. It's not the case here. Everyone has done a different project, and to be honest, the projects are all very diverse. So there's almost no overlap between projects. So that means that you'll be introducing some concepts that others won't be familiar with. You'll have been doing work that is quite diametrically opposed to what other people have done. Okay? If your original question fails to get a response, you can ask the second one. So just have a bit of a fallback, and if the first question gets the good response, you don't need to worry about the second one. But do remember, you only have 5 minutes for the questions. These are a few tips. Because you'll be getting the access to these slides, or you'll actually be getting this. You'll be getting this recording, which will have all of this information. But I'll also post the slides for you. They'll be posted to announcements and they'll be posted to Facebook. So you can actually run through here. There's just a little bit more, tips. I've got at the bottom there, if you plan to use any videos in your presentation, please don't. That will make life so much harder. But if you do feel that it is necessary, then contact me in advance, and we can see how to make that work. But these are just some tips for you later. And these are some technical requirements, just so that you have these on record for yourself, so you know exactly what you need to do. Test your setup well in advance of the session. If you come in to collaborate, one of the things that I'll be asking you is, have you run the setup wizard? And it should show up on the recording that at the top, Tools, Audio Setup Wizard. You click on that, and it will actually run through a little setup process to ensure that the sound quality is at the right level for your headphones and for your speaker. Okay. Now we'll go on to the presentation example. Excuse me. So 30 minutes that's taken. It's quite a lot of information to get through, but perhaps if we thought about the slides themselves, I think probably being fair, they're quite dull in terms of the look of them, but you'll notice that each one of them was quite legible. There wasn't too much information crammed onto each slide, and it was only with the last ones, the tips and the technical requirements, where you got quite a bit of information. And I'm more than happy with that. But the other ones, the ones that were the core pieces of information that you needed to know, they were all quite limited. There wasn't a lot of text on there. That takes me back to something I didn't mention. But when you are doing the presentation, it's really distracting if you just read off the slides. We can read the slides ourselves. We don't need you to read them for us. You would be far more, it would be far more beneficial to you, and you'd be far better placed if you had a slide. If you feel that you need to read a certain amount of information, you can't just look at a slide and discuss it. That you can't just speak openly off the top of your head and without any notes. It would be far better for you if you had a slide with a couple of points on it, and then you might have some notes that you're sitting in front of you. We can't see them. So we see the points, and you mention, okay, point 1 is this, and then you'll discuss point 1. But the discussion will be on a piece of paper in front of you. It won't be something there on the screen. When people do that, that's when they tend to clog the screen with too much information, because they're afraid that they won't be able to remember everything that they need to discuss. Well, in this instance, you're not standing in front of an audience. You'll be at home or you'll be somewhere by yourself, so you can have those few notes down. A few points on the slide, the notes in front of you. Mention the point and then use your notes. Okay? And that will be far better for us as an audience, And the same thing applies for you when you're the audience member. You'll find it very distracting if there's a lot of information on the slide and the person just reads it, because you'll be wondering, well, why are they doing it? I could do that myself. Ideally, and in a good presentation, you won't read entirely off a sheet. Okay? I do realise that people don't have a lot of experience doing presentations. I know myself what it was like the first time I had to present in front of an audience, and I did very much read off a sheet. So I know that it can be quite intimidating, and I do appreciate how stressful that can be for people. But you just don't. You just, if at all possible, don't want to get into the position where you're just reading what you're just reading from a piece of paper. Try to use it as a guide, as something you can fall back on. Use it for maybe the more complicated pieces, but try, if at all possible, to speak freely. It just sounds a lot better. It's a lot nicer for the audience as well. So here we've got a presentation that a student's done in the past semester, and I'll go very quickly through what they've done, what they did well, what worked, and what I think is perhaps good for you to use as some ideas. This is not a blueprint. This is not something that you must follow, and I'm not saying that this is perfect, and I'm not saying that it has everything, but this is a guide because students have asked, what have people done previously? What do their presentations look like? Now, this will be available for you. You'll get the slides, you'll get the presentation, so you don't need to ask for another one. This will actually be here on our Collaborate presentation for you. All right, here we go. Title sheet. Obviously, I think we can all sort of understand that. I've taken off the person's name, but what I would like you to do is you'd have a title there so that everyone knows what the title is of the topic that you conducted, and then you'll actually have your name. That's greatly beneficial for me because I need to put the slides into the right order. Now, what they've done is they've given us an outline of the presentation. So we know from this slide what it is that they'll be talking about during the course of the presentation. Okay? It's always good, if you think about it in terms of an introduction, the introduction will actually provide a lot of this information. Here's what we're doing in a presentation. Okay? This is the structure that I'll be following for the next 15 to 20 minutes. It's also good for you as the presenter because you know what you're falling back on. You know, okay, I have to get through these points. I've got 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. I need to work out then, if these are the key elements for me, how much time do I spend on each one? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 things there, so maybe that gives me 3 minutes, just over 3 minutes per section, or I might want to throw a little bit more time towards one and a little bit less for another. So this is the background. So if you can see for the first slide, I'll go back to that, the background. Why am I doing this? So in this slide, but we should more point out it's at this point of the presentation, the student is telling us why they decided to do this project, what motivated them, what was their particular interest in it, what was it about this particular topic that made them want to do this as their project. So why am I doing it? And then the problem that they identified, the problem that motivated the project. It might be for you, I'll go back to the first one, it might be for you, you talk about what it is about yourself that there might be something personal as to why you chose this topic, that you have a particular interest in a particular area, and that's where the topic comes from. It might be that the topic is related to an area that you want to work in. It might be that the topic's related to the country you live in. It might be that it's related in some way to something to do with you as an individual or as a member of a group. And then there's the problem. There's a problem that you've identified in some way. You might have identified that problem through reading. You might have identified that problem through personal observation. You might have identified it through work. I know that in one situation a student was aware of a particular topic but had identified it occurring within their workplace. And so there's the motivation. They know they had identified this situation occurring and they knew that there was a problem. And so the problem motivated their interest in the research. This just leads into a bit more. So we've talked about the problem, and now we're starting to provide a bit of the background. Okay? If we go back to the structure of the presentation that the student presented for us. Whoops. This really falls into background. Okay? And then this is the research question that emerged. So this is a very well structured one. This all falls into what they call the background. They're talking about why they're doing it, the problem that they had identified or the problem that they had become aware of, and then the research question that emerged from their study. Now they've got the design phase of the document. Not all of these things will apply to every single person. Now, not everyone will have needed to design an argument, but you will all have needed to design a question. You might want to talk about, as this student's done, about how you actually have created the question, how you've established it. Right, I'll move on to another key component, the search criteria. So this is where they're talking about how it is that they used, that they selected the information that they used in the project. Obviously very important, regardless of whether you're doing a practical project or you're doing a research project, there will have been some data collection. You'll need to let people know why you chose the data you did, what were the criteria, but you don't want to go into too much detail, okay? You'll notice there that they've actually provided two things here, keywords, star evaluation method. They can discuss those, but you can't spend a lot of time just looking at how many slides they have. They've discussed the research method. Now, it was applicable to them, but it mightn't be applicable to every student. All right? Not everyone will have a methodology. Not everyone will have a method. However, for all of you, the data collection process will form part of that method. How did you choose the information? What did you include? What did you exclude? So if you don't actually have a specific methodology that informs the project, you can talk about the inclusion and exclusion strategies you used for selecting your data. Now that just means what sort of sources did you use? Why did you use those sources? What problems did you encounter? For example, a student might say, my topic is one that hasn't produced a lot of research data. The only work that's been done has been, perhaps it exists in company records. It might be in, the work might be done, but it hasn't actually been published. You'll often find in various industries that while they do a lot of projects, they don't write them up. They don't turn them into journal articles. Obviously, in a university, we think of everything in terms of publications, but out in the real world, for libraries, for businesses, for law firms, there's not always the same time, well, there's certainly not the same interest, but there probably isn't also the same time to turn these things into publications. Key findings. Yes, of course, you want to tell people what it is you found. You're doing the project. You've told us why you were interested in doing the project. You've told us about what the question is that motivated that you developed. You've told us about the problem that you've identified that motivated it. Now you want to talk about the key findings. Okay? My feeling is that the key findings should be something that carries a bit more weight, so that you will want to obviously give me background about the topic itself, how you arrived at it, what the question is you developed, how you selected your data. You'll want to provide all of that information, but the findings, which is really where you're showing your analytical skills, I always think that that perhaps gets a bit more weight than the others, and you'll notice that the student here has actually got more than one slide on the findings. They've also identified gaps, and I have mentioned this to a number of students that when you're looking at literature, one of the things you should be looking for is not just what is in the literature, but what isn't there. It's always nice when you identify a gap because it is some place that you can contribute. Okay? The gaps are what we look for as researchers, or as academic researchers. We look for gaps. We look for things that haven't been done. If you're not a researcher, but you're someone who's building devices, someone who's thinking more about the practical and applied projects, it might be apps, it might be websites, you obviously want to look for gaps. Not in the literature, but gaps in the technology. What hasn't been created and what needs to be created. Okay, so these are the sections you'll be talking about, gaps. And then a summary. I think this is incredibly useful because the audience will have been sitting there at home, wherever they are, they'll have been listening to you do your presentation. And if you just say, in conclusion, I really enjoyed doing my project and thank you very much for listening. That's great, but people can forget what you said at the start. They've been listening and they've been trying to understand, especially if a lot of these concepts are new to them. So the summary just quickly takes them back. The summary quickly allows you to say, right, so in summary, these are the key things. Here's a little bit of the background. These are the objectives. This was the search criteria I used. These were the key findings, and these were the gaps that I identified. So it just sums it all up in one slide, just in case anyone's in any doubts at all. The summary should be quite easy to read. Just go back and look at what you've said prior to it. And then questions. This person's provided two. They've put them on the same slide. I suggest putting them on individual slides because that way people aren't reading both slides. You want them to only read the question. Sorry, they're not reading both questions. You want them only to read the question that they're answering. So if you put two questions on the one slide, people will have the tendency to read both and either engage with the one they like the most or get a little bit confused, get a little bit distracted. So I'd say one slide per question. But the key thing to look at here is what are or what were your beliefs concerning adolescent relationships with technology? Now, this is their interest, adolescent relationships with technology. They will have discussed that during the project. But that's not so complicated that people can't engage with the question. People will be able to have an opinion. They understand adolescent and they understand technology, and they can put the two together. The second question, what is your position on digital natives? They discussed what digital natives were. They've actually discussed it. So they've said, what is your position on it? And the first question, what are your beliefs concerning this topic? So they're general, very open-ended questions that don't require them to have any more knowledge than you provided for them in the presentation. The first one, certainly, it's just general knowledge, so they can actually engage with it on a very broad level. The second one is based on the information you've provided to them, but they're still very accessible, they're still very easy for people to engage with. Okay, references. Most people include the references, and you can if you like. You're not going to read off the references. So I'm certainly not going to mark you up or down or sideways if you have or do not have the references. It's not, as I said, it is something that if you're using a quote within the presentation, then I expect you to include a reference at the bottom of the slide even, just to tell me where that came from, if you're going to be using a direct quote. But otherwise, it's not necessary for me that you include this extensive list of references. And this is only one slide. There were actually two. I just got rid of them. It was just too much. It's just not something you're going to be reading. I want those references in your assignments, not necessarily in your presentations. So, now I'll sum up the key points. A manageable number of slides. I've put there in brackets 15. You have 15 to 20 minutes. You have to decide for yourself how many slides is manageable. If I've got 15 to 20 minutes, there might be enough information on one slide that I want to spend 3 minutes on it. Then that's fine. You're only going to be spending then 5 or 6 minutes on each slide. But a manageable amount. If you've got 20 slides, and it does happen, people will send in 20 slides. If you have 20 slides and 20 minutes, it's 1 minute per slide, and it is very hard to just power through it. You'll probably be talking so quickly that people will struggle to keep up with you, or there'll be so little information on the one slide that you might as well have presented it with another piece of information. Now, I've said they're visually interesting but not distracting. If you look back at the slides that I've used here, as I've said before, they're quite dull. There's nothing really exciting about them, but they're not white. They're not just a blank screen, you know, a white piece of a white slide with some black writing on it. There's a little bit of something there. That's great, but it's not distracting. There's not too much there. When you look at the slides that the student used, you'll notice that there is, I believe, one image and I think only 2 what I would call graphics, where they've actually incorporated something which is not actually a table, but have incorporated a graphic element into it. But they're just 2 very basic ones. It just means it's good because nothing can go wrong with them. The image, of course, the image related to what they were discussing, but it wasn't necessary. It wasn't. It didn't distract from what they were trying to provide. So strike a nice balance of how much you use in terms of graphics. You don't want them to be something that overwhelms the presentation, and you want something that relates directly to the presentation. Not too much information on each slide, so it's not cluttered. This slide is cluttered. To my way of thinking, this is cluttered. But I didn't want to put it onto 2 slides because I know that in this instance you will actually be reading it a bit later, and I didn't want you to have another slide you might need to print out or another slide to read. But this is too much for me. If you look at the ones that I did previously, they're quite simple, they're quite easily laid out. Limited jargon, so it's easy to follow for everyone. They don't need a great deal of an understanding of any specific terms. Any terms that they need understanding, you need to provide the understanding for them. So you need to explain it. But don't have a presentation that's so full of jargon that people will get lost after the first or second slide. You want to identify the reasons for undertaking the project, provide some background to the work and the gaps in the current research. Summarise the presentation at the end in case people forgot a point. Just goes back over it. In summary, what I've been talking about in this presentation is, and these are the points. And then provide the questions as required. It's not the most daunting task. It can feel a little bit scary at the start. Regardless of whether you're a local student or you're an international student, there is still that little bit of fear about talking in front of a group of people, even when you're doing it online in this sort of setting. Don't be intimidated, and I know it's very easy for me to say. I did feel that myself when I had to do it the first time, but don't feel intimidated. Think of this as an opportunity to tell everyone what you've been doing for the semester. Don't think of this as you putting your work on trial. It's not. No one else knows what you know. They've all been doing different projects. They don't have the same information you do. So you in essence, are the expert in this particular field. So just tell them what it is you've been doing. Make sure that when they walk away from the presentation, that they're very clear on everything that's happened. They're very clear on why you did it, what the whole thing was about, what you found out, the way you can see that work can be done in the future. So it gives you that opportunity just to let them know what you thought was interesting and what you and to give them a bit of an understanding of something that they probably never heard about before. And once again, to provide the questions as required. I keep going over that, but it has been something that people forget to do the questions. And I will say it again. I would put the questions onto slides, one slide per question, rather than try to just ask the question. I've noticed in the past when people do that, it often means that they have to repeat the question a few times rather than people being able to just read it from the screen. And of course, you've only got 5 minutes, so what happens is you lose time, and it doesn't help the presentation at all. Okay, that's really everything I wanted to talk about in terms of doing the presentation. I'll just mention there the final assignment, which is due Friday, week 15 by midnight. That is Friday, June the 12th. Submitted directly to me. I'll be talking to you more about the final assignment as we lead into it. You have your assignment brief, so all the information's laid out in that, but I'll be able to speak a little bit more about it in the weekly videos and in any emails you send me or any consultations we might have. Okay, now I did mention the days and the dates. We are going to be conducting a poll to work out what are the best days and dates for the presentation. I'll be providing people with a link so they can go and they can put their answers in. You will be asked to nominate every day that you can, your first preference and your second preference, and the days that you cannot present at all. I'll provide you with some information about how to fill that out in the next week or so. We're in week 11 now. The presentation's due in week 14, so I will set the poll for you. I'll put it together on the weekend and have it ready for you to start filling out as of next week. All right, that is everything. I've talked for a good solid hour, and there really isn't anything more that I need to say. So I'll say thank you very much to everyone for coming along, for anyone who did come along today, and for then those people who are listening now. All right, any questions, you know you can email me or post them to Facebook. If you do need consultations, as I keep saying, give me 3 days notice, and I should be able to arrange a time to meet with you. Okay, thank you very much to everyone.